The myth versus the mud. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a medieval assassin. Go on, let the image form the way it always does, the way 1,000 films and novels and video games have carefully constructed it inside your imagination over the years. You see him, don't you? The dark figure perched on a rooftop, cloak rippling in a cinematic breeze, the sharp jaw, the calm eyes, the blade that catches moonlight with almost artistic precision. He has a code, he has a mentor, he has a tragic backstory delivered in perfectly timed flashbacks that make you root for him despite everything. He is dangerous and elegant, and somehow, inexplicably, always clean. This image is everywhere. It is also almost entirely a beautiful and elaborate lie. The medieval world did not produce that man. It couldn't afford to. The real medieval assassin was not a product of discipline and destiny. He was a product of desperation and circumstance, shaped not by ancient wisdom, but by the specific and unglamorous ways that ordinary life could collapse around an ordinary person until there was nothing left but bad options and worse company. The romanticism we have draped over this profession like an expensive cloak belongs entirely to us, to the storytellers and the dreamers and the game designers. Strip it away, and what you find underneath is considerably colder, considerably grimmier, and considerably more human than any legend would dare admit. There were no mountaintop monasteries where silent masters taught the philosophical weight of death between meditation sessions and scenic sunrises. There were no secret orders with elaborate hierarchies and poetic names and meaningful symbols pressed into wax seals. Or, rather, and this is where history gets genuinely interesting, when organizations even remotely resembling these things did exist, and one or two arguably did, they were so far removed from the fantasy version that comparison almost requires an apology. Real clandestine violence in the medieval world was not orchestrated by shadowy brotherhoods of enlightened killers. It was managed messily and dangerously by frightened people making terrible decisions under impossible pressure. The weapons were not elegant either. Forget the perfectly balanced, custom-forged blade slipped between armor plates with surgical expertise. Medieval assassins worked with whatever they had, a knife bought cheaply from a market stall, a length of rope, occasionally poison sourced from someone who knew someone and definitely asked no questions. The tools were ordinary because the people wielding them were ordinary. That was, in the most tragic sense possible, the entire point. Extraordinary weapons attract attention. Extraordinary people attract attention. Extraordinary people attract attention. The job required someone and something that the world would simply not bother to look at twice. And this deliberate, grinding, soul-eroding ordinariness was where the real story lived. Not in the moonlit rooftops of our imagination, but in the mud and the cold and the hunger and the fear. In the life that came before the job, in the choices that were never really choices at all. That is where we are going, and it is darker and stranger and far more fascinating than the myth ever managed to be. Nobody woke up as a child and whispered that dream into the dark. Boys in medieval Europe dreamed of becoming knights, merchants, monks, anything with a title, a purpose, a seat at someone's table. Girls dreamed of safety, of warmth, of a roof that didn't leak. Nobody drew little daggers in the dirt and said, "This is what I want to be when I grow up." And yet, somehow, the world kept producing them, quietly, steadily, one broken life at a time. The path to becoming a medieval assassin wasn't a road anyone chose. It was a road that chose you after everything else had already fallen apart. It began, more often than not, with a soldier. Picture him returning from a campaign that nobody won cleanly. He had fought in the mud and the blood for a lord who died badly. Or worse, a lord who simply stopped paying, no pension waited at home, no parade, no gratitude carved into stone, just a man with calloused hands, a working knowledge of where the body gives way under pressure, and absolutely nowhere to go. He drifted into towns, he drank too much, he got into trouble. And then, one quiet evening, someone noticed the particular and useful way he carried himself, like a man who had already decided how a room full of strangers might die. Then there were the thieves. Medieval prisons were not reforming institutions. They were holding pens where the guilty and the merely unlucky sat together until someone decided what to do with them. When a man walked out, if he walked out, he wore his time like a brand. Employers didn't want him. Neighbours didn't trust him. The church might offer soup, but not salvation from the reputation. A man like that couldn't go back to farming. He couldn't apprentice at a forge or stand behind a merchant's stall, but he could move quietly. He knew back alleys the way honest men knew their own kitchens. He understood how to watch without being watched. That particular skill set had exactly one premium market in medieval society. And then there were the simply forgotten peasants who had lost everything to famine, to plague, to a landlord's greed dressed up as lawful taxation. Men and women so far removed from the machinery of society that their disappearance would cause no ripple. No one would ask where they had gone. No record held their name. In a world built on visibility, on land rights, guild memberships, church registrations, invisibility was both a curse and, in the right hands, a weapon. What bound all of them together wasn't skill. It wasn't training. It was erasure. They had, each in their own devastating way, been rubbed out of the world's ledger. And the terrible irony was that this erasure, this thing that had destroyed them, was precisely what made them useful. You cannot hire a man the world is still watching. You hire the man the world forgot existed. That was how you ended up here. Not with a choice, with a disappearance. It never happened in daylight. That much you could count on. The sun had no place in this particular transaction. It was too honest, too revealing, too fond of casting shadows in the wrong direction. No, this happened in the grey hours. No, this happened in the grey hours. In the back corners of taverns that didn't ask questions. In the narrow spaces between candlelight and darkness where two men could sit close enough to whisper and still be invisible to everyone else in the room. This was where the deal was made. This was where one life ended and another began, and neither began, and neither of them belonged to the man doing the hiring. The person sliding that coin purse across the table was almost never who you might imagine. Forget the cartoonish villain twirling a mustache in a castle tower. Medieval assassination was a surprisingly democratic business in its clientele. It was the merchant who had been cheated out of a contract and couldn't afford a legal battle he was guaranteed to lose. It was the minor noble whose brother stood between him and an inheritance. It was the bishop, yes, the bishop, who needed a rival's voice permanently silenced before a very inconvenient truth reached very inconvenient ears. Power in medieval Europe was fragile and pharaoh. Cheers all at once, and fragile, ferocious things have always been willing to pay to stay intact. The approach itself was an art form born entirely of necessity. Nobody sent a formal letter. Nobody made an appointment. Instead, there were intermediaries, the fixer, the go-between, the man who knew a man. A merchant might mention to his steward that a certain problem needed solving. The steward would visit a certain inn. The innkeeper would leave a message with a certain regular. And so the whisper travelled hand to hand, mouth to ear, until it reached someone willing to listen without flinching. The distance between the buyer and the deed was the entire point. If something went wrong, and something always threatened to go wrong, everyone needed enough space between themselves and the act to survive the aftermath with clean hands and a plausible alibi. For the assassin sitting across that table, the negotiation was its own kind of danger. Ask for too little and you signaled desperation, which made you disposable. Ask for too much and you became a liability before the job even began. There was no guild rate, no standard contract, no mediating body to appeal to if the client decided, once the work was done, that silence was cheaper than payment. You were negotiating with someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to have people killed. The irony of that sat heavy, like cold iron in the stomach, and you learned quickly not to look too long at it. And yet they agreed. Every time they agreed. Every time they agreed. Because the coin purse was real, the hunger was real, and the name whispered across that table, however dangerous, however impossible, felt, in that candlelit moment, like the only door left in a room with no walls. They picked up the purse, they memorized the name, and they walked back out into the dark, carrying both. The job was never truly over the moment the deed was done. Every assassin who survived long enough to spend their coin understood this with a bone-deep certainty that no amount of ale could wash away. The killing itself, however harrowing, however close run, was only the first half of the nightmare. The second half began the moment you turned and walked away from what you had just done, heart hammering, hands unsteady, every shadow suddenly wearing a face. This was where most of them fell. Not in the act, in the aftermath. The first instinct was always to run, and the first instinct was almost always wrong. A man running through a medieval town in the grey hours drew eyes the way fire drew moths. Towns were small, intimate, suffocating in their familiarity. Everyone knew everyone's gait, everyone's coat, everyone's reason for being on a particular street at a particular hour. A stranger moving fast was a story waiting to be told to the wrong person. So the truly experienced ones, the rare few who had done this before and lived, they walked. They slowed their breathing. They stopped at a market stall and touched a piece of cloth they had no intention of buying. They became, through sheer terrifying willpower, ordinary. Disguise was a tool, but a cruder one than legend would have you believe. There were no elaborate costumes, no perfectly crafted false identities, with forged documentation and rehearsed backstories. Medieval disguise was humbler and more desperate than that. A monk's robe borrowed or stolen from a laundry line, a merchant's hat pulled low over familiar features, dirt rubbed deliberately into the face to change its geography. The goal was never to become someone else entirely. It was simply to become someone else entirely. It was simply to become someone forgettable, someone the eye slid over without catching, someone whose presence explained itself without requiring a single word. Bribes were the other currency of survival. Gatekeepers, night wart. Gatekeepers, night wart. Himen, innkeepers who asked too many questions with their eyes. All of them had a price, and a wise assassin always kept enough coin back from the job to pay it. The problem was that bribes created witnesses. Every palm you greased was a hand that could point at you later, especially if the investigation grew serious, especially if the dead man turned out to matter more than expected. You were constantly building a tower of silence out of people who had every reason to eventually speak, and yet they were caught. Not always dramatically, not always in a torchlit chase across cobblestones with guards shouting and dogs baying. More often it was quieter and sadder than that. A drinking companion who heard one too many guilty silences, a landlord who noticed boots caked in mud from the wrong part of the county, a single detail overlooked in the adrenaline of the job that unravelled everything with the slow, inevitable patience of a pulled thread. Medieval justice, once it had your name, was neither gentle nor slow, and it had absolutely no interest whatsoever in your reasons. Surviving the job was one thing. Surviving the silence afterward was something else entirely. A slower, quieter, more corrosive kind of suffering that the coin purse did absolutely nothing to fix. The moment a medieval assassin walked away from a completed contract, they entered a new kind of prison, not one with walls or bars or guards with torches, one built entirely out of knowing what they had done, knowing who knew they had done it, knowing that the most dangerous person in their world was no longer the target. It was the client sitting comfortably somewhere warm, already calculating whether keeping them alive was still the sensible business decision. The paranoia arrived quickly and it never left. Every unfamiliar face in a tavern became a possibility. Every conversation that stopped. A moment too soon when you entered a room carried weight it may not have deserved. A medieval assassin between jobs lived in a state of permanent, low-burning alertness that looked, from the outside, like ordinary wariness and felt, from the inside, like slow suffocation. Sleep was a negotiation. You chose your room carefully, never the one at the end of a corridor, always the one near a window, always with something solid against the door that would make noise before it gave way. These were not the habits of a dangerous professional. They were the habits of a hunted animal that had not yet heard the dogs. The isolation was total and it was mandatory. You could not confide in a friend because having a friend meant having someone who could be threatened, bribed or broken by the wrong people asking the right questions. You could not take a lover without eventually navigating the impossible geography of a secret that large living inside something that intimate. You could not drink freely because drink loosened the tongue in ways that the sober mind spent enormous energy keeping locked. Every natural human impulse toward connection, toward confession, toward the simple relief of being known by another person, all of it had to be swallowed back down and held bare indefinitely at considerable internal cost. And then there was the client. The relationship between an assassin and the person who hired them was perhaps the most poisonous dynamic the medieval world quietly produced. It was built on mutual incrimination. Each of them held something over the other which should have meant safety for both, and in the short term often did. But power in medieval society was never static. Clients rose and fell. A merchant who had hired you in desperation might become a magistrate with a reputation to protect. A minor noble who had whispered a name across a tavern table might find himself suddenly in a position where your continued existence was an inconvenience he could now afford to eliminate. You were not an ally. You were a liability wearing a human face. Some disappeared voluntarily before that calculation was made. Changed towns, changed names, changed everything about themselves that could be changed and abandoned the rest. Others waited too long, seduced by familiarity into a false sense of stability. The ones who lasted were the ones who understood, with cold and unsentimental clarity, that silence had a price, and that price was everything else. History is a grand hall filled with portraits. Kings stare down from gilded frames with expressions of permanent authority. Generals stand frozen mid-gesture, pointing at victories already won. Saints glow softly from illuminated manuscripts, their suffering transformed by time into something almost beautiful. The hall is long, and the portraits are many, and every single one of them was painted by someone who decided that this life, this particular life, was worth remembering. Walk that hall long enough, and you begin to notice something. There are gaps between the frames, darker patches on the wall where the paint is older, and the stone beneath is bare. Those gaps are where the assassins go. They left almost nothing behind. Not by accident, by design, by necessity, by the brutal arithmetic of survival that had governed every single decision they ever made. A medieval assassin who kept records was a medieval assassin, building his own gallows one entry at a time. No diaries, no letters home, no proud confession to a priest who might someday write it down. The paper trail that historians depend upon simply did not exist, because creating it would have been the last mistake a careful person ever made, so they dissolved. Not slowly, not dramatically, just quietly, completely. The way morning engine frost dissolves when the sun finally decides to show up. What scraps did survive came from the wrong end of the story entirely. Court records, mostly. Execution logs, the dry execution logs. The dry, bureaucratic accounting of medieval justice, noting that on such a date, a man of no fixed address and no recorded trade was hanged for the murder of so-and-so, the nature of the crime suggesting hired involvement, the name of the employer conspicuously and permanently absent from the document. The assassin made it into history. The person who hired him did not. The person who hired him went back to his estate, or his cathedral, or his counting house, and lived out the rest of his days with clean hands and a clear official record. This was the final indignity. Not just death, but a death that served someone else's survival even at the very end. And the coin, that coin purse that had felt so heavy with possibility in that candlelit tavern, that had seemed in one desperate moment like a doorway out of a ruined life, it was almost never enjoyed, spent in fragments on the run, or seized by guards upon arrest, or simply never collected because the client had already decided that a living assassin was a dangerous loose end and a dead one was just a footnote. The payment that had justified the entire terrible bargain had a habit of evaporating at precisely the moment it was most needed. So here is what remains: not names, not graves, not legends whispered with admiration around fires. Just the gaps between the portraits, the blank spaces in the record, the faint and uneasy feeling that the history we know was shaped, in part by hands we will never see, and voices we will never see, and voices we will never hear. They were the footnote nobody wanted to be. And the cruelest part, the part that lingers long after everything else fades, is that they knew it. Every single one of them knew it right from the beginning.